How's it going, everyone? My name is Falling Hurts, and I have yet another review for you today. And today we're going to be looking at Midnight Fight Express, a game you can play pretty much anywhere you want, from the Switch to the Xboxes, PlayStations, or even PC. This is a game that left me with a lot of thoughts. One that had more butts than an exposition episode of Game of Thrones, personally. So, you know, there's like, this is good, but, or this is bad, but, things like that. And I'll break that down in just a few moments. But overall, to get the kind of TLDR, I liked the game for the most part. But, with that being said, let's hop right into the review and the kind of nitty-gritty stuff you need to know. Releasing August 23rd of this year, 2022, from the developer of Jacob's Winnel, Midnight Fight Express was published by Humble Games, and it also saw a day one release on Xbox Game Pass, personally where I played the game. And that is at a $19.99 US dollar value, so kind of the premium indie game type experience. The game features a kind of isometric view perspective, not quite a top-down, but it is very much a beat-em-up type game, with a kind of minimalist art style that is super detailed in its environments, which I personally loved. I overall enjoyed the aesthetics of the game, and that to me was the most intriguing part, seeing as how beat-em-ups aren't usually my thing, but the cost-to-value ratio for Game Pass, how could I pass that up? Now, with that price point in mind, it took me about 6 hours to complete the game, all 41 levels. So if you're looking to only play the game once, you won't get much replay value out of going back and doing some of the challenges, unlocking more of the cosmetics, then hey, that's cool. For about $20, you'll get 6 hours-ish of gameplay. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Now, with that being said, let's hop right into the review. And while I'm going to forego the combat conversation towards the end of the video, first off, I'd like to talk about the thing I think is the most important to a lot of the games that I do review, because this is what always draws me in, and that's the visuals. Now, first off, as I already said earlier in the video, the visuals are really nice. The minimalist style that I already mentioned is pretty consistent throughout the whole game, and it's just really appealing to look at and allows for a lot of varied and unique looking levels. And that's, of course, spread across 41 levels, and that's something really to write home about personally. And here's my first but of the video. But while the visuals look really great, something that the game didn't take advantage of very well was actually the photo mode implementation. Something that's not necessary for the enjoyment of the game, I'll let that be known right now, but something that I think if this photo mode was done right, you know, maybe just a slightly better angle, maybe even a slight color filter, the photo mode would have went a long way to selling the game's visual aesthetics. Unfortunately, it's all fixed on the same isometric axis that we already have, with minor adjustments that can be made, including just changing the time of day, which is fine. That's actually really cool and something I'd like to see in more games. Unfortunately, it was just lacking overall, and I didn't really use it outside of the first level when I was trying it out. Speaking of when I first launched the game to try it out, I also had a bug. It was an infinite load bug the first time I launched the game, which is probably fixed now, and this was on the Xbox Series S, where I just couldn't load into the game. It would keep trying to load my profile, which I currently hadn't had yet, and my fix at the time was to change my Xbox profile picture or whatever. But once again, to round trip back around to the visuals conversation, one thing that I can say is that the game is very varied. Very varied, is that the proper thing to say? Either way, there's going to be a myriad of different levels and different actions to go about doing, and minor spoilers, I guess this honestly isn't really no story spoilers, but situational spoilers, I suppose. There are unique levels like riding on a train or riding motorcycles or jet skis, which are all visually very nice once again, but the gameplay on these specific levels really do suck. I don't know what it is, but the vehicle levels, maybe the exception being the train because you're still on foot, all kind of don't feel too good, and ultimately just end up feeling pretty frustrating. Now, to bounce over to the story aspects, I actually really liked the premise for the game, where a night of insane levels of crime is brought to a halt by you and your companion drone. As you play the game, you're basically just retelling the story to a couple of cops, trying to play good cop, bad cop, and being completely incompetent the whole time. It's actually got some pretty funny dialogue along these parts. And with really cool set pieces such as gang wars between the bros and the brus, or non-lethal fights with game devs using pillows and Nerf guns, or even things crazy like zombies, robots, and rat people, and it's all really cool, but it gets ruined by one thing, and that's the pacing. My biggest criticism of the game itself is actually that it can't decide if it wants to be a combat first game or a story first game. Or at least that's how it comes off to me as the player. For instance, all the story is given through dialogue boxes throughout the game, which are just text, of course. There's no voice acting. And I think this really hurts the pacing of the gameplay in honor of the story, but the story doesn't take itself super seriously in the long run regardless. So with that being said, I think this is a pretty huge negative to consider. And while I wasn't overall impressed by some of the major plot points of the story itself that the game was trying to tell, I actually did think some of the dialogue in smaller moments, a random offhanded guard dialogue or random reference to some other piece of media, was actually pretty funny and rather self-aware. So it was refreshing to read these things, and it's really confusing to me as someone who's trying to review the game to say, no, we shouldn't have had any dialogue or text boxes, but that's not true. I think it does add something to the game, but overall, it's still a negative. So it's really hard for me to kind of understand what was going on here. Personally, while I believe voice acting would have been super expensive for this game, as there is a lot of dialogue, as I said, it gets in the way of the combat quite a bit. I really do think it could have been dialed back a bit, a lot more of it told through the kind of story or the environment in a way, you kind of imply what's going on without always having to say it. I think that would have helped a lot, even if we would have gotten a lot of those funny moments I talked about cut out. And then the moments that were still voiced could have been done through strictly the drone, which you could have had a text-to-speech program, I guess, to do. I've actually seen that done in a few games. Hell, even Metroid Dread did it, but hey, who's to say? A game with really pleasing to look at visuals, but with a very lackluster story is something not really to write home about yet. But let's look at probably the main aspect of the game, and that is actually the gameplay loop itself. Midnight Fight Express is broken up into a couple of different categories. You've got your combat of the level itself, and then also the hideout, which is where you go to in between levels as a way to kind of regroup and, upgrade your skills, and potentially even change your appearance if that's what you so choose to do. I'll go ahead and start with the hideout since I have the least to say about it. And honestly, I didn't like the way the tutorial worked for it. It kind of just throws everything at you all at once after you complete the first level, but that's okay. Ultimately, you have 41 levels to eventually explore everything and figure out what you actually need from this screen and what you don't. What I will say that I did really appreciate outside of the customization, which was fine, you earn money based on how well you do per each level, and then you can spend it on different customization options. I mean, you have to unlock some of the better stuff by doing the challenges of the level, which suggests some replayability, but that's entirely up to you as the player. But what really stood out to me from the hideout was actually the skill trees. Now, there's no picking and choosing which ones you're doing. This isn't an RPG or anything like that. There's no classes. But what actually is presented to you are a bunch of skills that you'll actually use. Some of them are simple upgrades like being able to parry enemies with melee weapons rather than just enemies with fists, but it really gets more and more progressive as you go throughout the game, and it really leads to a nice sense of pacing through unlocks and things like that. Even if you can choose which ones you want to have earlier, ultimately you're going to have it all by the end of the game and be powered up for those final fights. Though it should be noted for a challenge, you can turn off any of these unlocks you have done if you want, for whatever reason, some bit more of a challenge. But personally, I don't recommend this as the combat feels a little sluggish at first, I can't lie. It's probably a combination of me being unfamiliar with the control scheme and then getting more used to it, but also the fact that as you get these new abilities and more, gameplay options, the combat really starts to feel fleshed out and fluid. The game towards the last half of the game feels so much better to play, and the enemies are like a breeze to fight. And with that being said, I think the combat to this game is really good. You can really tell that there was a vision to this aspect of the game, something I can't really say is true so much about the story aspect or kind of the user experience with the tutorials and the text boxes. Now, these new skills aren't the only thing that complement the gameplay in this aspect. There's also different music for every level, which all sounds pretty congruent and very similar. And with that being said, I kind of think it runs together a bit, but overall it gets the heart flowing in just the right ways, get you pumped up for that combat, which is exactly what you would want. So the music does its job, but it's nothing super memorable. There's no tracks to remember. Now, with that being said, I do have a few minor nitpicks with the gameplay that I would like to air out first and foremost. As I said, first off, the game does take a little bit longer to get feeling good, which is never something you want, but this is a shorter game, so that's completely fine. But one thing that I didn't like, especially towards the end of the game, there's a few parts where it's not the enemy encounters themselves that are the issue. For instance, what I'm talking about here is there's enemies with guns, and while that's fine and that's a proper challenge where you need to identify the enemies to take out first, It is a problem when, through a checkpoint, you're at a disadvantage against these enemy encounters if you have to do it again. For instance, I roll up with my weapons or whatever the first time around, but say I get, the bad luck of the draw, I die. I go into the encounter with less health or whatever, and it just doesn't work out. So I reload the save, I'm right next to them, the combat encounter starts again, but this time, say I don't walk in with any weapons, I have no advantage over these people. They've already aggroed me, all of this. The issue here is that it's very, very hard to actually deal with these enemies once these situations have completely changed. It's like playing the game with a disadvantage without even changing the difficulty. Little instances like that happen throughout the game, and it only happens a couple of times, but there were definitely a few moments where I felt frustrated, but never turned off from the gameplay as a whole. To kind of end my criticism here, I actually really, really like the gameplay. I would love to see it improved and better scenarios be provided in the future, but honestly, as far as the gameplay goes, you couldn't ask for more. The 2 permanent tools outside of your melee attacks are also really good to use, and not something you usually see in a game like this. A single-use pistol that needs to recharge over time, and a grapple rope or hook or whatever you want to call it that you can use on enemies. But the way they're used in the kind of isometric setting is just really fun, and while there are other guns in the game, that doesn't stand out as much. It's a nice little, last-ditch effort to kind of take out the bad guy, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark style. But after 6 hours with Midnight Fight Express, that's really everything I had to say. To summarize, I think the visuals were really great, the soundtrack did its job, and the combat was exceedingly above every other aspect of the game. However, I think the story aspects as well as the user experience really bring it down in a lot of ways that you can really tell that this isn't something that was fully fleshed out in any way that was proper. I can't say how much I'll actually think of this game going forward, but personally for a $20 price, I don't think it's worth it. I think Game Pass, if you're already playing games, then yeah, maybe that's fine. But I think I would definitely pay probably somewhere in the $10 to $15 range for this game. Even as someone who doesn't play a lot of beat 'em ups, I really think it's a good game in that aspect because it felt really fluid. It's just that the game so constantly wants to trip itself over all these different aspects. So yeah, I hope that helps. That's really about it. If this review was nice or helpful, then consider checking out some of my other ones. I try to do one once a week or every couple weeks, something like that. But regardless, thank you so much for watching this one. My name is Falling Herds, and yeah, bye.